In November of 1869, a yacht called the Aigle slid through 120 miles of new water cut into the Egyptian desert. On board, the Empress of France raised a glass with the Khedive of Egypt and 20 European monarchs as the world's most ambitious infrastructure project opened to traffic. The fireworks at Port Said could be seen from the open sea. 3 miles inland from the celebration, there were grave pits. Some of them were still being filled. 157 years after the first shovel struck the sand, we are still arguing about who built this canal, because the people who paid for it were never the people who profited from it. This is the story of 120 miles of water that ended one empire, embarrassed 2 more, and once stopped 1/10 of all world trade with a single ship that turned the wrong way. The empire was the British Empire, and what ended it in the summer of 1956 was not a battle. It was a speech. An Egyptian colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser walked up to a microphone and with a few words took the most powerful empire on earth and quietly showed the world it was finished. That is the story we are going to tell. And it begins 100 years before the speech, with the digging. Before the canal, getting from London to Bombay meant going around the Cape of Good Hope. 4 months of open ocean, 4,000 miles of detour, ships rotting at sea, cargo that turned over twice a year if you were lucky. The Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean were separated by a thin strip of Egyptian desert that no empire had successfully cut since the pharaohs filled in their own canal 12 centuries earlier. Ferdinand de Lesseps was a French diplomat, not an engineer, not a financier, not a soldier. He was a charming man with good handwriting and a friend in the Egyptian palace. In 1854, he convinced the Khedive Said Pasha to grant him a 99-year concession to dig the canal. The British called it impossible. The French called it visionary. The Egyptians were not really asked. Construction began in April of 1859. The Egyptian state did not have machines, so it provided people. Through a system called the corvée, the government conscripted peasants from villages along the Nile. 20,000 men at a time, rotated every 3 months, hauled out into the desert with shovels and reed baskets, and no pay. They dug with picks. They dug with baskets. They dug with their hands. A cholera outbreak in 1865 killed thousands in a single season. The official ledgers do not give us a precise number for the full 10 years. The modern estimates settle on something close to 100,000 Egyptian dead. Exhaustion, disease, malnutrition, sunstroke, all of it. Hold that number, 100,000. It comes back at the end of this story. They do not appear in the inauguration photographs. There is an essay published by Egyptian Streets on the centenary that calls them the workers erased from history. They are not exaggerating. The opening ceremony, when it finally came, was held for the Empress. That was 1869. In 1875, the Khedive Ismail, the man who had hosted the Empress, who had borrowed against the future of Egyptian agriculture to finish the canal, went bankrupt. Within weeks, the British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, was on the line to Lionel de Rothschild for a £4 million loan, and Egypt's 44% share in the canal company changed hands without a vote in Parliament. By 1882, British troops were on Egyptian soil, and the new King Tewfik was being walked through Cairo by a British political officer. The canal was now a strategic asset of the British Empire on what was, in theory, still sovereign Egyptian territory. The men who dug it were dead. The Egyptians who had owned it had been bought out and then occupied. And for the next 74 years, the most valuable shortcut on Earth was run from Paris and London by men who had never set foot in Egypt. Those 74 years carry us through 2 world wars. Britain comes out of the second one broke, tired, and shrinking, but still holding the canal. And then, in Egypt, a new generation of army officers grew up asking the obvious question: why does the most valuable thing in our country belong to somebody else? This is where Gamal Abdel Nasser walks back into the story. In July of 1956, he stood on a stage in Alexandria and gave the speech this documentary is named for. 70 years later, Egyptians are still arguing about what he actually said up there. The speech ran 2 hours and 43 minutes. But the part that mattered was hidden in plain sight. In a single name he repeated 3 times. The lesson Nasser's generation had drawn from the Canal's first century was brutally simple. Building it had earned Egypt nothing. Owning it on paper had earned Egypt nothing. The only thing that had ever counted was standing on it. By the early 1950s, the Egyptian elite that had taken Disraeli's deal, the kings, the pashas, the British-trained civil servants, was finished. A circle of young army officers had pushed King Farouk onto a yacht in 1952 and put one of their own in charge, a 34-year-old colonel running a country whose canal he did not control. By the time the Canal crisis came, 4 years later, Nasser had one obsession, and it was not the canal. It was a dam. He had read everything he could find about Ataturk, about Bismarck, about American steel mills, and he wanted to drag Egypt into the modern world in a single decade. The Aswan Dam was going to be the largest civil engineering project in Africa. It would generate electricity for half the country, irrigate land that had been sand since Pharaoh, and lift Egypt into the 20th century in a single decade. The Americans had agreed in principle to fund it. So had the British. So had the World Bank. Then in the spring of 1956, Nasser signed an arms deal with Czechoslovakia, recognized Communist China, and took Soviet aid. And to Washington, in the middle of the Cold War, that looked like Egypt switching sides. So on the 19th of July, John Foster Dulles pulled the American loan for the dam in a single afternoon. The British, who would not fund what the Americans would not, followed within hours. But Nasser still had to pay for that dam, and there was only one pot of money in Egypt big enough: the canal tolls, which were still flowing every day to the foreign company that owned it. So he made his decision. On the 26th of July, in a square in Alexandria, in front of a crowd that filled the corniche from the harbor to the rail line, Nasser stood at a microphone and gave a speech. It ran in fragments, in colloquial Egyptian Arabic, instead of the formal classical tongue. And 3 times in the middle of it, he said the name Ferdinand de Lesseps. That was not a tribute. It was a signal. The same evening, at the exact moments those 3 syllables left the loudspeakers, Egyptian engineers walked into the Suez Canal Company offices in Ismailia, 200 miles east, where the radio was on. They presented themselves to the French managers and said the company was now nationalized. They did not draw weapons. They did not need to. The president had told the world before he had told the staff. Nasser's Egypt is not a comfortable thing to celebrate. The same government that ended British control of the canal also accelerated the country's slide into one-party rule. The secret police, the press shut, dissidents disappearing, his rival Mohammed Naguib under house arrest. And yet, the same regime that did all of that also pushed literacy in 3 languages, redistributed 700,000 fadans of land to peasants who had never owned ground, and built the dam he promised. Both of those things were true at the same time. And across the Arab world, people heard the repression and the achievements together. And what they took away was simple. An Egyptian had finally taken the canal back from Europe and made it stick. Within 90 days, 3 men were sitting in a private villa in the southwestern suburbs of Paris. Anthony Eden's British government, Guy Mollet's French government, and David Ben-Gurion's Israeli cabinet were drafting a plan. The plan was simple and shameful. Israel would invade Sinai. Britain and France would issue an ultimatum demanding both sides withdraw from the canal, knowing Egypt would refuse. Then, British and French troops would land as peacekeepers and take the canal back. The Israelis insisted on a signed copy. The British signed under their real names. That document, later called the Protocol of Sèvres, survived. It is how we know the war was scripted in advance. On the 29th of October, Israel rolled into Sinai. On the 31st, British and French bombers struck Egyptian airfields. On the 5th of November, British and French paratroopers and helicopter-borne Marines landed at Port Said in what most military historians count as the first combat helicopter assault in history. And then, in Washington, the President of the United States, who had not been informed, who had been lied to by his closest ally about the largest amphibious operation since Korea, picked up a telephone. The American Treasury began dumping British sterling reserves onto the open market. The pound went into free fall. The British currency reserves were running out by the hour. The Soviet premier was threatening nuclear strikes on London and Paris, and meaning it loudly enough that no one in Westminster knew if he was bluffing. Anthony Eden had 8 hours to decide between the empire and the currency. He chose the currency. He chose the call. He chose to stop. By the second week of December, the troops were on ships sailing north. In January, Eden resigned. He never held office again. The British Empire did not end with a war it lost. It ended with a phone call it received. For 11 years after Eden's phone call, the canal simply worked. Egypt ran it, the tolls went to Cairo, and the world got used to the new arrangement. Then, in June of 1967, the Six-Day War broke out between Egypt and Israel. And within 72 hours, the Egyptian government had scuttled block ships at both mouths of the canal and sealed it shut. The canal that had ended an empire had just stopped the world. 15 ships were inside the canal when it closed. Freighters from 8 countries: Britain, West Germany, Bulgaria, Sweden, the United States, Poland, France, and Czechoslovakia. They had sailed in expecting an ordinary passage. They came out in 1975. Some came out under tow. 2 came out under their own power. None of the men who sailed them in were the men who sailed them out. With no way north and no way south, they anchored in the wide salt lake in the middle of the canal, the Great Bitter Lake, and they waited. Within months, they had organized. Crews formed the Great Bitter Lake Association, the GBLA, and elected a commodore. They issued their own postage stamps, hand-carried out by helicopter to be franked in Cairo. They held church services on the British ships and yacht races between the Polish and Bulgarian crews. In 1968, the same year Mexico City hosted the official Olympics, the trapped sailors held the Bitter Lake Olympics. 14 events including water polo, high jump, archery, and small-bore rifle shooting opened with a ceremony on the deck of the British freighter Port Invercargill. The Polish team won the medal count. The desert sand built up on the hulls until the convoy turned a soft yellow. Crews rotated through every 3 months, year after year, for almost a decade. Sailors aged. A few got married while on rotation home. A few died. The cargo on board: Australian wool, Indian jute, German machinery, rotted slowly in the holds. The men learned each other's languages. They drank each other's liquor. They photographed their kids in matching crew sweaters next to a salt lake that had not been salted by the sea in 2,000 years. When Egypt and Israel finally agreed to clear the canal in 1975, only 2 ships in the original 15 could still move under their own power. They were the West German Münsterland and her sister, the Nordwind. On a Sunday in July, they sailed up the Elbe into Hamburg harbor, 8 years late, to 30,000 people on the docks. The men who came down the gangways were not the men who had walked up them. The canal had stopped. The world had not. Time had moved without them. Think about what was sitting in that lake. This was the same canal the Fellahin had dug out of the desert by hand, the same canal Disraeli had bought with a banker's loan, the same canal Nasser had taken back with a code word. And for 8 years, it did nothing at all, while every cargo ship on Earth went the long way around Africa instead. The canal had modernized world trade and made fortunes in London, in Paris, and in Cairo. It had also killed 100,000 of the men who dug it. That number from the beginning of our story. And now it was teaching the world one more lesson. The most important shortcut on Earth could simply stop. The canal reopened, the ships came back, and for 46 years it worked so well that the world forgot the lesson. Then, on the 23rd of March, 2021, a 400-meter container ship from a Taiwanese shipping line called Evergreen, registered in Panama, crewed by Indians, en route from Malaysia to Rotterdam, was caught broadside by a sandstorm in the southern section of the canal and ran aground sideways. The Ever Given wedged itself between both banks. For 6 days, the canal was closed. In those 6 days, the world lost something close to $10 billion a day in trade. Empty shelves in California, idle assembly lines in Wolfsburg, container queues in Singapore. Salvage crews from a Dutch firm spent the week dredging the bow. The most shared image of the year was a drone photograph of a single excavator at the foot of a stack of containers the size of a city block. The ship was eventually refloated by a full moon's high tide. Step back far enough, and the whole story of this canal is the same lesson taught 3 times. The men who built it could not own it. The empire that owned it could not hold it. And the country that holds it today could not stop one ship that turned sideways in the wind. And the canal, indifferent to all of them, has been open for 10 years longer than the British Empire was. There are 6 more choke points like this one, and right now, every one of them is open and working. So was Suez, every single day, until the day it wasn't. Sooner or later, one of the others stops too. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. There's another choke point story on the way. If it changed how you see the map, leave a like. And in the comments, tell me which of the world's 7 gates you think breaks next.